Before we get started creating all the different things with the Perlin noise generator, with Blender's noise generator, I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like in the end. So you're looking right here at a sphere. Other than that, there's no modeling, just the sphere that comes out of the box with Blender. And if you look at this, you can see that there are scratches, there's rust with different colors, there's a cloudiness to it, there's parts that are glossy and parts that are scuffed up, and all of this you can create completely with Blender's noise generator, that single texture, and I'm going to get in and show you exactly how to do that. This video is all about the noise texture. I'm going to cover what it comes from, how it's used, and how to implement it in Blender. So let's get started. So the noise texture is based on something called Perlin noise, and Perlin noise was developed by a guy named Ken Perlin. He did it for this movie. It came out in 1982. You may have heard about it. It's called Tron. It was iconic for its time. He even won the Academy Award in 1997, and they did a remake much later that was actually really cool. So Perlin noise is a fractal, meaning it's a texture or picture, or however you want to think about it, that's created completely from math algorithms. So these are examples of Perlin noise, and these are not Perlin noise. This is an example of what Perlin noise, the actual fractal, looks like. So what is Perlin noise? So in order to describe what Perlin noise is, let's think about what random numbers are. So on the left is a graph of random numbers, and you can see it's really, really jagged. The numbers jump around all the time. There's not a particular method or rhyme or reason to it because it's completely random. But if we look at Perlin noise, we see that it's got some of these same random aspects, except there's smooth transitions between the random numbers. And that's essentially one of the things that makes Perlin noise special. So if we think about this in terms of 2D, we have here a completely random 2D plane that has little pixels that have different grayscale values. So some are black, some are white, and some are something in between, and it's completely random. But if we look at Perlin noise in 2D, it has this like cloudy look to it because the transitions are much smoother. So what is Perlin noise really doing? So we can think of Perlin noise or a Perlin noise generator kind of like a box, right? And we take that box and we put a number in. The number can be X, it can be X and Y, it could be X, Y, and Z. We put that number in and we get a grayscale value out. That grayscale value out can be anything between 0 and 1 or -1 to 1, depending on how you're implementing Perlin noise. So if we then think about putting as X 4 numbers in, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and we graph that, we can see that each thing comes out, each number gives us a different output, right? And if we look at one number between 0 and 1, one number between 1 and 2, and one number between 2 and 3, and so on, we can call that, we'll say that's a frequency of 1. Now, let's say that we increase it by 2. So not just 1, 2, 3, and 4 we look at 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, and so on, and we enter those numbers in the Perlin noise algorithm, and we get even more detail because we get a new number for each one of those numbers that we entered in. And we can say that now we're sampling at twice the frequency, so it's got a frequency of 2. We're also decreasing the amplitude by a half, which is important, but not important for you to understand how this works. But we can keep increasing the numbers, the number of times we're sampling within the same range, and you can see that we get more and more detail with each one. Now we can take all of these 4 graphs and add them together, and this gives us a different look completely that has aspects of all 4 put together. Now we can apply this to a 2D plane here. We see we have one, the Perlin noise generator that we talked about before, that's very cloudy looking, but when we add, looking at more samples, higher frequency, you can see that we get more detail. And if we do that again, you see that we get even more detail. And this, each individual graph, each individual frequency that we add, we call octaves. So you're wondering, why do we care about octaves at all? Well, if you're actually using the noise texture generator in Blender, that's essentially detail. When you increase the detail, you increase the octaves. Now, if you remember when we talked about octaves just, 5 seconds ago, we're looking at more and more samples in the same range. So when you increase the detail, you increase the octaves, which increases the amount of computation Blender has to do in order to use your noise texture generator. So what we're going to look at is the noise texture generator in the context of Blender. So what you have here on the left is something I created where the morphology of this is completely created with Perlin noise. And what you see on the right is an example of a sphere that has different material properties on it. It's got scratches, scuffs, rust. All of that is created completely with Blender's noise generator, or one of Blender's Perlin noise generators. So let's go ahead and get into exactly how to use Perlin noise, or the noise generator. Before we get into all the amazing things you can do with this noise generator, or the Perlin noise texture, or the noise texture, however you want to say it, let's just connect what you just learned to how this works in Blender. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my scene. Now, you could hit shading and this would change your scene, but this adds a whole bunch of stuff that I really don't want. So I'm going to go back to the original, and I'm just going to change this last bottom pane by clicking over to the left with the shader editor. So I'm assuming that you know the basics of Blender, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this tutorial. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, in the shader editor, I'm going to select the default cube and go ahead and delete the default cube, because it's going to be much easier to look at this from just a plane perspective. So I'm going to hit 7 to go from top view. I'm going to shift A to add a plane. I'm going to zoom in on that plane. Now I'm going to give that plane a new material. We're going to just call it noise. Now with that as our new material, I'm going to change the view shader to the one that lets us preview the material that we have. So I have the plane, and now I'm going to delete the principal BSDF. We don't really need that. We're not really talking about creating a usable texture. So what we're going to do is just to give you an idea. So I'm going to shift A, I'm going to click search, and I'm going to type NOI, right? That gives me the noise texture. You could also get to that by going to add texture and then going to noise texture. And then I'm going to connect the factor to the surface. Right, and I'm just going to do that by dragging over. I'm going to assume that you don't have Node Wrangler installed, just to give you an idea. So this is that cloudy texture we were talking about. The next thing I'm going to do, just to make things a little bit easier to see, is add a color ramp node. Now the color ramp node maps everything in the picture, everything in the inputs, to what's in the color ramp. In this case, it's black and white and all the grays in between. So initially, if I just mute this, you can see that it doesn't do anything. But we're going to drag the blacks up just a little bit. And the point of this is just so you can really see when we make changes to these parts that we were talking about. So right now, the noise texture is set to 3D. Now I'm going to bump this down to 2D because we're only working in 2D right now, because this is the plane. When we do things with the sphere, you'll see that it will need to be in 3D because the sphere is 3D, but right now it can be 2D. So we talked before about the detail, or the number of octaves, and you can see as I increase this, I get more detail. Now Blender will allow you to increase this all the way up to 16 on its own, and after that, I'm really not sure if you're allowed to, because you can certainly type higher numbers in here, but I don't know if it's actually calculating those numbers. So this is the detail, the octaves that we were talking about before. The other part is the scale. So the scale works pretty much just like you would think. I can zoom in and things get blurry, or I can zoom out and I get more variations of what we were just talking about. So you have scale, you have detail. The last thing you have is distortion. On Blender's documentation site, they don't have a lot of information about distortion, but if you looked into the mathematics of Perlin noise, really you're changing one of the inputs into the Perlin noise generator by using the Perlin noise generator and a couple of other parameters. But this is essentially what it does. We're going to use it to create scratches later. So these are what the 3 parameters you have, whether it's 2D, 3D, or 4D. Whether you want a different scale, detail, or distortion. So that is the basics. As we go through with this process and I show you all the different ways you can use the noise generator with Blender, I'm going to reference this picture just to give you an idea of what's going on. So when you look at this, you can see that there are scratches in some place. It's got rust, which I did overdo a little bit. It's got scuff marks. It's got shiny parts. And we're going to do this completely using the noise generator. But the first thing we're going to look at is creating these locations here that have the rust. So we need a mask to create these rust sections. So let's go ahead and set that up in Blender. Now, right now I have my scene set up where the bottom portion is the shader editor. So I'm going to go ahead and start a new scene so you can see how I did that. So like I said before, you could click shader over here, but then I get a lot of stuff I really don't need. So I'm going to go to modeling, actually back to the layout, and I'm just going to, instead of adding a new pane, I'm just going to change this one because for this, we're not really worried about animation. So I'm going to go over to the left corner and I'm going to select Shader Editor. I'm also going to make sure that you can see what I'm looking at. And yeah, so now you can actually see what I'm typing at the same time. So the next thing we're going to do is change this to a sphere, because a sphere is what you saw before and it gives you a good idea of what everything looks like. So I'm just going to hit X to delete this, Shift A to add a UV sphere. I'm going to go ahead and just use the default. I can change that over here for rings, radius, and segments, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave this the way it is. The next thing I'm going to do is head over to Object and Shade Smooth, just to give it a smooth look. And lastly, I'm going to give it well, not lastly, but another thing I'm going to do is give it a subdivision surface modifier just to make it even more smooth. I'm going to go ahead and crank this up to 2, so it'll say absolutely pristine and smooth. Now I'm going to give it a material, so I'm going to go to the Materials tab, click New, and under this part, I'm going to put Noise. So now we have everything set up to be able to look at this. I'm going to drag this up just to make it a little bit bigger. And for right now, we're just making the mask, so we don't actually need a shader yet for this. So in Blender 2.81 or 2.82, which is the one that I'm currently using, I can view what a material looks like. So I'm going to hit Shift A and search, and I'm just going to type noise, and we're looking for the noise texture. And I'm going to put that directly into the surface. So you don't see anything yet because we're at the section, we're at the viewer that doesn't allow us to see that. So if we hit the view shader, that allows us to be able to see what it actually looks like. So now we can see that we do have that cloudy portion, but right now it's set up to look at the coordinates for if it was generated. But in this case, we don't want it to be generated coordinates, we want it to be object coordinates. Right? So in order to use the object coordinates for texture coordinates, we're going to go ahead and add that. So I can say Shift A, search, and I put text for texture coordinates. And we're not going to really use it much, but it's usually good practice just in case you do want to change it to put a mapping node in between. This allows us to change the scaling and the rotation if you wanted to. So we're not going to use it a whole lot, but it's good practice, and generally you would use that. So this gives us this first basis for the first part of what we're looking at. So right now, as you can see, this looks nothing like what we need. You can see that the places here where the rust is very jagged and sparse. So one way we can change that is Shift A, add, and then search color ramp. Right, so we're going to add a color ramp in here. And now this is going to give us the ability, if we drag the blacks up, to make it much more sparse. And you can see here, now we have something that looks a little bit closer to what we were doing before, but it's not quite jagged enough. It's not jagged enough, and then this area is very still really cloudy. But remember, this is a map, so this is what's separating two different materials from each other. So we want there to be a really clear demarcation between one area and another. So in order to do that, I'm going to drag my whites over, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to drag my whites over to get that area and this demarcation line that's going to be between the two to be very, very clear. And I do that by bringing the whites and the blacks really close to each other. Now, if I zoom in, I can bring them even closer. And right now, this is still really too much. So I'm going to bring this over even more. Now, if I take a look at this, brush sections look a little bit better, a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring this white over some more to make it a little bit more stark. Now, the problem is they look more like droplets. They're not jagged enough. And if you remember before, one of the issues was the detail. So we can up the detail some, and that will make it more jagged. Now we can also mess with the scale a little bit, which will give us slightly different looks. And now we have that jagged look that we wanted for the rust. Now we can increase this all the way up to 16, but if you look closely, there's a certain point to which it doesn't really make a big difference, right? So when we get to about 8, 9, it's about as jagged as we need it, right? And it's not everywhere, it's just in certain places. That's exactly what we want. So this is the first portion, and this is the place that demarcates where we have the rust and where we have the other parts. So before we stop with this part, what I'm going to do is just to label it, because we're going to have a really complex node set here. So I'm going to shift and select all 4 of these. Then I'm going to go to, actually what I'm going to do here is hit Shift P, right? And that just puts a frame around the ones we had selected. And just to make it easy for us in the future, I'm going to go under Item, and under Label, I'm going to put Rust Mask, right? And now we know that this area is our rust mask. Now that we have our rust mask, let's go ahead and use that, and let's go ahead and make some rust. So just to see how we would mix two different shaders, I'm going to say Shift A, I'm going to search, and I'm going to go for Mix Shader. So Mix Shader allows me to take two shaders and put them together. And if I use this FAC here, this is what tells it what shader goes where. So right now, FAC is at the 50%, so it's really just adding the two over each other, and I don't really have anything here. So I'm going to Control right click slash, sorry, that's what happens when you hit Shift. So I'm going to take the color out of color ramp into Factor, and at first it's not going to be anything, and that's because we don't have any inputs into these two shaders. So just to give you an idea of what that would be, I'm going to use a diffuse shader, which is probably the simplest of all the shaders you can do. I'm going to duplicate that with Shift D, and I'm going to plug that into both of these. And initially, you don't really see anything, and that's because they're the same color. But if I switch one of these to black, you can see that based on this mask, this rust mask that we created, the bottom texture or the bottom shader is what's going to be black, and the top shader is what's going to be white. So the majority of it is white. So in this case, it means that our rust would need to go into the bottom one. And of course, this can be any color we want it to be. It didn't really have to be it didn't have to be black, it could have been any color, just to show you the idea of what it's supposed to be. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this because we're going to actually put a rust color right there. So the rust that we're going to use is also based on, guess what, the noise shader. So let's go ahead and add Shift, search, we're going to type in noise again. And we're going to do that same exact thing we did before, where we add a texture coordinate. So just to show you a different way to do this, we can go to input, and under input we can find our texture coordinate, and we also want the mapping, so I do Shift A, search. Honestly, searching for it is probably the fastest way because sometimes it's hard to remember precisely what menu it's under. So if you remember what menu and you're good with that, that's good. But I'm going to change this to object, and I also meant for this to be object. I said I was going to do that and then never actually did it, but we're changing this to object. Sometimes if it's too close, you have that issue. But I'm going to change this to object, and it's slightly different. So let's go ahead and leave it for right now. Honestly, you would get a better result from doing object, but since we did all of our parameters based on generated, it's fine because we're not going to do a whole lot with this. The important thing is that when we move it, so I'm going to select it, rotate, that it moves like we think it will. Now, if we did different things like scaling it, it would have a different effect whether we use generated objects, but we're not going to. So right now we have our object to object coordinate to mapping, and then from our mapping to the vector portion. And now we need to create the shader that we need for the rust. So we're going to use probably the most powerful shader, one of the most powerful shaders Blender has, the physics-based shader. So that is the principal BSDF. So I just type print for principal, and I'm going to feed that into the bottom section of the mix shader. So right now, there's nothing particularly there. And that's because it's white, so we don't have anything here initially, so it's white on white. But if we change the base color to something slightly more red, you can see now it's showing up. So let's go ahead and do a few things. Well, if you look at our original texture, there's a lot of bumpiness in here, right? And that's because we're using the normals. So in order to use this texture for the normals, we're going to have to use a Shift A, search, bump shader, or bump node, and that allows us to use grayscale values to create that what looks like geometry. So we're going to take this factor and we're going to put it into the height. Right, I'm just going to pull these out a little bit. So right now it takes Blender a little while to do the math to figure this out. And we kind of have an idea now of what that looks like. Now the colors don't look great because we just randomly selected that color. So let's go back to almost white. And this isn't quite what we're looking for, but I just happen to know that a scale of about 30 along with a detail of 6.1 and no distortion gives us a more rocky looking environment. Now we're not going to change anything here, but we could have. There's different things we can do with the scale here that makes it look a little bit more rocky or a little bit different. We can also change the location. Well, we don't need to. This looks good to me, and the strength right now is set to 1. If we felt like this was too strong, we could of course down that. So let's go ahead and just so you can see what that looks like. So we're decreasing that strength down, and you can see there's a slight difference to that. So now we have, to a certain extent, we have where this bumpiness is. So let's also control the color inside here. So we're going to use the same noise texture because we want everything to match. So we're going to say Shift A, and then we're going to add a color ramp to this. So out of the factor, I'm going to put that in because we're only using the grayscale at the moment. And I'm going to feed that into the base color. So initially, it's not really going to do a whole lot. Right now, Blender is just doing the calculations to try to figure out what's going to go there. But now, here is where we're going to change our colors. So we're going to take this and we're going to make it a kind of reddish color. We're going to take this one and we're going to make it a kind of orangish color. And then we're going to add one by hitting this plus sign, and we're going to make this one black. So Blender, again, is doing the calculations, but after it's finished, we'll have the ability to select this one, drag it all the way down, and make it look black. So now we have a little bit more realistic looking, and we can shift these around depending on how we want it to look, how orange or how red things are, just to give you an idea. So that is the look for the actual color of it. But we don't want to stop there, right? We have some color in here, but we can also affect the metalness and we can affect the roughness of it. So if we want some portions to be shiny and like metal and other portions to look like they're covered with rust, we can simply add some more. So we could connect this directly into the roughness, which is going to make some portions rough and some portions smooth, so it's going to make some portions kind of reflective and some portions not reflective, which is good because we don't necessarily want much of this to be reflective. And then the other thing we can do is also put this into the metallic. So if you think about rust, rust is actually not metal. It's a dielectric, but there might be some metal parts to it, so we can mix those two by putting them here. Now what we can also do by hitting Shift and then dragging across is putting connectors here. And what I'm going to do now is add another color ramp. So Shift A, search, color ramp. And I'm going to drop that in between, right? Now Blender is doing the calculations. The good thing about when Blender is doing these calculations, once they're in place, we can then shift things around and we don't have to wait for it to do those calculations. So if we want to give it some more sparkly sections like this, that's what allows us to do it. But we see right now that it's really sparkly in the wrong places, or it's a little bit too sparkly, so we don't want much. So let's tone that down. And that way we still have some sparkliness, but for the most part, it's dull, like it should be, because it's rust. So this gives us our rust sections, and we did that completely with Perlin noise. So like we did before, I want to do some housekeeping and make this a little bit easier to see. So we're just going to shift some things around. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this connector by hitting Control X. That allows me to keep the connection. I'm going to minimize that one, bring everything a little bit closer together. So I'm going to shift click these, bring them over. Then I'm going to hit B for box select. Make sure everything here is selected. And then I could hit Shift P to put them in their own frame. And then in this frame, I'm going to have that item and I'm going to call it rust. So the next thing we're going to do is add the paint bump to it, which is pretty simple. So the next thing we're going to do is address this painted portion here. And this is the painted portion of metal, so that's why you see through it, you can see scratches and things that have metal underneath it. But if you look really closely, you can see that it's really not perfectly smooth. In fact, no surface is really perfectly smooth. This space. So if I zoom in on this, you can see that it's completely pristine and smooth. And while that's nice, it's not really realistic. So we need to address that portion of it. So right now, this is the part of the material that's white. So if we change this color, you can see that everything where we don't have our rust section is this color. But we actually don't want to use the diffuse shader. What we're going to use, Shift A, we're going to use the principled BSDF because it has so many uses. And I'm going to put this in its place and I'm going to hit X to delete that. So if you drop a shader on top of a line, Blender will usually be able to figure out which ports need to be connected. So now we have this and it's white, and we're going to add our bumpiness to it. So similar to what we did before, except this time it's for this much larger portion. So I'm going to say Shift A. I'm going to add a noise texture, just like we talked about, because that's the whole point of what we're doing. We also need a bump node, because we need to be able to translate this factor data, which is grayscale data, into the height map, into the normal. So if I zoom in, you can see that I take the factor, and I take the factor from the noise texture into the height. And just like we did before, we're going to go ahead and add our texture and mapping coordinates. Right, and right now, this is much bigger than we need it to be. But let's go ahead, Shift A, and we're going to find our texture coordinate. And then I'm going to say Shift A again. We're going to add our mapping. And honestly, I don't need to do this, but it's good practice, because later on there might be something we want to tweak, and we want to have the ability to do that tweaking through the mapping if we want to. So I'm going to take object and put that into our vector, and then I'm going to take the vector part of the mapping and put that into our noise texture. So now this will give us the texture we're looking for, but not before we shift some of these parameters to be more specifically what we're looking for. So now we can see that this is way, way too big, and the strength is probably too high. But I happen to know that a scale of about 1,000 is what we're looking for, right? And now you can see that it's a lot more textured, but really it's still too much. We can leave this at 2. We don't really need any distortion, but the strength, we can take that way down to 0.05. So now if I look really closely, it's actually hard to see with this particular color. So let's take it from white to something slightly different. Oh, and I changed the wrong one. So I changed the subsurface number, which really doesn't have much of an effect on anything we're doing. What I meant to change, and I can reset the default value, which sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but we're going to change this color, right? And as I move this around, you can see that now it does have a little bit of texture. Now, if we decided that this was, in fact, not enough, we could increase this, and now you can see it even more. But I think that's probably a little bit too much. So I'm going to go back down to this 0.07, and then you can see the texture is still there. So I'm okay with this. So that's all we really needed to do for the actual texture as far as how bumpy it is. And we're going to do that same thing that we did before. I'm going to box select these. I'm going to hit Shift P, put a frame on it, and now we're going to say paint bump text, or just paint bump text. Now our paint has a particular texture. The next thing we're going to do is get this base paint to have this scuffy nature to it, where it's blue and sometimes darker, shiny, and sometimes a little bit less shiny. So let's get to doing that right now. So the first thing we're going to do is add this noise shader again. So I'm going to copy these because it's pretty much exactly what we need to do. So all you have to do that is select them, hit Control C and then Control V, and then I just drag them to put them in the correct location. So now I'm going to put these values back to about what they were before so that we don't see anything crazy. The other thing I'm going to do is, instead of object, I'm going to use generated, because that's going to give us the best look of the texture that we want. So if I plug this directly into base color, we're pretty much going to get nothing, and that's because the noise texture is really not giving it what it really needs to create the color that we want. Now it is going to actually try to do it, and what the noise texture is giving it is a grayscale version of what we're looking at, and you can kind of see that that's what we get. But in order to get the colors that we want, like we saw in the file that I showed you earlier, I'm going to add a color ramp node. And within the color ramp node, I'm going to change the color. So I happen to know what colors work best, and I have them saved here. But let's go ahead and change them to that. So I'm going to use the dropper here, and I go to, in order to change the color in the color ramp node, I click on the actual arrow here. Then I click on the bar, I click the dropper, and I go there. So if you don't have the color saved, like I'm sure you don't, I'll click here, and then you can see that the hex number for it is BCDAFF. So you could type that in all caps, or you can look at these RGB values and type those in, and that'll give you the exact same color that I have here. Now the other color I need to change, I'm going to change it in the same way by clicking on the arrow, clicking on this portion here, using the dropper, and using that saved color. But if you want to use the same color I have here, you can pause the video and see that the RGB values are here, or the hex value is 4265A4. So if you type that in, you'll get the exact thing that I have here. So this isn't still quite what we're looking for, and that's because we don't have the parameters set up to be what we want. So I happen to know that what's going to end up working the best is if we have 6 here, and then for detail, we put 7.2. Now you can shift these around, and I'll show you what that looks like, and you may find something that looks better to you than what I decided looked good to me. So you can see that this gives us this scuffed nature, but this isn't the only place we can make a change. We can also shift our coloring node. So we can take those darker portions and make more of our environment darker. And you can see now that we kind of have this set up to where it looks scuffed, but really it's not quite there, right? Because it's all the same shininess, really. But some parts should be shiny and some parts should not be shiny, right? Because that's what it would look like if we actually had this in real life. So we need to affect the shininess. So there are a couple of things that affect the shininess if we're talking about a painted metal. One is how metallic it is, right? So if I decide to move this metallic slider while Blender does some more calculations. So if I move this metallic slider, we're essentially deciding to make it metallic or a dielectrics like paint or rubber or something else like a ceramic. But if we're talking about a painted metal, some parts of it are the paint, which is a dielectric and not metal at all, and some parts are the metal, which obviously is metal. So we want to be able to use our texture here to give us some of that same ability. So the other thing that controls what it looks like is the roughness. So even if we don't have a metal here and we have a completely painted piece, we still have how shiny that is, and we can control that through the roughness. Now you can see once we take the roughness all the way down, it gets more shiny, and you can see that bumpy texture that we added before. But it doesn't make any sense for this to be old and also shiny. So in order to do that, we want to control this with our texture and our noise texture as well. So we're going to feed this value into our roughness, but we don't actually need to do color. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift D, and we're going to use a completely new one. So shift A, search, and we're going to search for color ramp, and under color ramp, I'm going to pick another color ramp, and I'm going to take something out of the same factor we had before into this color ramp, and I am going to feed that into our roughness. So Blender's going to do its calculations, and you're going to see that the roughness is now going to vary dependent on where the mask or where the texture here is dark and where it is white. So after it does that, we're going to wait here for a second. And now when I look at it, some parts, the darker portions are going to be more shiny than the other portions. So if we move it here, we can then see that the whole thing is getting a lot more shiny. So that's actually not what we want. We want it to get less shiny because this is less new. So we're going to move this to the side, and now you can see that less of it is in fact shiny, but we do want slightly shiny sections somewhere. The other thing is that we don't want anything like completely shiny the way that it is now. So we're going to go ahead and lighten up this section just a little bit. So nothing is going to be completely shiny. And now you can look here and you can see there are places that kind of shine through, but not everywhere. So we get that same effect of having some parts be shiny and then some parts not be shiny. So this is the only part we needed for that base mask of being a little scuffy or not. So we're going to do that same housekeeping we did before. We're going to select everything, hit Shift P to put it inside of a frame. And I'm going to name that frame Base Paint. So now we know what it is, and if we want to make changes to it, we can easily find it. So the last thing we need to do is add all of these scratches, because nothing this old would not have scratches. So let's add the scratches. The first thing I'm going to do to add the scratches, I don't really need these two things anymore, and they're not yours anyway, is to add another set of noise textures. So the quickest way to do that, since this is kind of already set up the way we want it, I'm going to shift left click all four of these. I hit Shift D, I pull them to the side, they're still selected, I hit Shift P, and that puts them in their own frame, because we're going to have to do that anyway. So I'm going to select this frame, I'm going to grab it, I'm going to pull it up here so that it can be, so everything looks to be a little bit more organized. So I'm selecting the frame, and I'm hitting G for grab, and let me redo this. Yep, okay. I hit G for grab, and that allows me to organize everything the way I would want it to be organized. So right now, this is going to be the scratches. So in order to see what that's going to look like, I need to connect this directly to the base color. So this is going to take out the other part, but that's okay for right now, because we just want to see what the scratch is going to look like on their own. We'll do the actual mixing of the two in a moment after we do the scratches. So after Blender does this, we'll see basically the same setup we saw before. We'll just need to make changes to it. So right now, this is set up to look like the stuffy, cloudy section. But in order to look like scratches, we're going to have to make some changes to it. So the first thing we're going to do is change the scale and make it higher, right? The next thing we're going to do is actually take the detail down. Now, for the first time and the only time in everything we're going to do, we're going to change the distortion. So the distortion is what's going to give us some of these lines, or what look like kind of ridges, right? So I happen to know that a distortion of 6.6 looks pretty good for this. And now I'm going to move around our color ramp. So before, you can see that we're kind of losing parts of this as I increase the gray, but we don't really need gray, we need black. So let's bump this all the way down. And now when I move the black over to the right, you can see that we just get like a subset of the things we had before. And depending on how many scratches I get is how far over I move it. If I want almost none, I can move it just there, and then you see only the occasional stuff here. But if I leave it here, you can see that we have a pretty scratched up. And also with this black color, you kind of get a better idea of what the effect this roughness is having on our thing here. And you can tell that it looks really, really old. So this is the look that we're going for. But right now, we don't really want these to be white. I didn't say this before, but this is more of a mask than anything. So we want this to clearly be one or the other in most cases. So we drag that, and you know what? I think that this is probably a little too scratchy. So I'm going to move over my black and get rid of some of those scratches. So this looks good to me. So now the question is, how do we merge the two, and where does this go? So now that we know what this looks like, we want this to be the section that shows us the metal underneath. Because if we had something that was painted metal, it would be paint on the top and then metal underneath. So in our case, we're going to make this, we're going to put this into the metallic. And after this does some little bit of calculations. And like I said before, Blender has to do a certain amount of calculations every time we increase the detail, right? There are more octaves in this one. This one had 3.5 octaves, the other one before this had 7.2 in terms of detail. So we're adding quite a bit of computation on the ends. So now you can see that we have these scratches, and everywhere there's a scratch, that piece shows as metal. Now, if we had time, what we could do is also mix this into our roughness, because these portions usually tend to be more smooth as well. But just in the interest of time, we are not going to do that, but we are going to add it to our base color. So right now we're going to take what we had initially and put that into our base color, and that's going to also give you an idea of what everything looks like when it's together. And that's going to just take a moment here. It's interesting because usually when you're working with Blender, the thing that takes the most time is rendering. But in this case, rendering is not actually that big of a deal. It's doing the actual calculations for using all of these different procedural textures, all of the same procedural textures. So we're almost done. But the thing I want to add last is making these marks more whitish, right? And we want to add the scratches to the actual color. Right now, we're just adding it to whether it's metallic or not, and that's not really giving us the effect that we want. So we need to add it into what's happening here for the base color. And there's a couple other things we can do to make it look a little bit better. But in order to add it, remember these are colors, not shaders. So we're going to add Shift A, search, mix RGB, right? And this is going to allow us to mix the two. I'm going to place it here because I want to inadvertently put it between two connectors. So in the mix RGB, one of the things we want to be in the factor is this scratch. So we put the scratch in the factor. We're going to leave one as being completely white. So this will allow the places where the scratches are to be white. And in the other place, we'll go ahead. Actually, I'm going to delete that. We're going to put our shader after it finishes doing the calculations. Hopefully it doesn't freeze my computer. The fact that this little spinning thing is still happening is good. So good news, it didn't freeze my computer. I'm going to put this into the top portion, and in the bottom portion, I'm just going to leave that as white. So this is going to allow me to mix the two, where the scuffs, or the scratches in this case, not the scuffs, are now going to be white. So you'll see that what that looks like in a second. So now our scratches are white, and this is almost what we want. So the other problem that you probably didn't notice is when we did the scratches the other way, they were dark. And that's because the scratches were the non-metal portions, but we want the scratches to be the metal portions. So there's a quick and easy way to do that. We just use something called an inverter node or an invert node, and we're going to add that there. So this means that everything that was 1 now becomes 0, everything that was 0 now becomes 1, and everything in between gets flipped. So this is going to take a moment. This is also partially taking longer, probably because I'm recording this at the same time that I'm doing it. And you can see that we have something that looks much older and much more scuffed up than it did before. I'm going to down this effect a little bit. And there you have it. So let's do just a little bit more housekeeping here. Now this particular one is for scratches. So we have the scratches. I'm going to give it some space so that the inverter is still here. We have the mix node. And ladies and gentlemen, that is all done with the noise generator. And for those of you out there who wanted to see how to do this also with an animation, let's go ahead and do that really quickly. So I'm going to do a horizontal split here. And I'm going to change this to the graph editor. And you'll see why in a moment. I'm going to drag this down. I'm going to leave it just in case we need it. And I think that we want our animation to be, I'm going to leave this as the EV editor. We want our frame to end, let's say something like 600. We're on frame number 1 right now. As you can see here, I'm going to select our sphere, I'm going to hit I, and I'm going to lock rotation. Now we don't really care about any of the rest of these, so I'm just going to left click on X Euler, Y Euler, and delete them all. Then I'm going to grab, I'm going to drag this over using the middle mouse button, hit Shift D, drag this over, and I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to open this up. I could have hit N to do that, and I see that the value is 5.16. I want this to be 1 full revolution, so I'm just going to type 360 there. The other thing I'm going to do is make sure this happens on frame number 600, so I'm going to type that in there. Now, if we play this, we see that it does spin, but it slows up and it speeds up and slows down, and that's not quite what we want. We want it to spin, and we want it to look like it's going to spin infinitely when it goes from 60 back to 0. So in order to do that, I'm going to select both of our control points here. I'm going to go to Channel, Extrapolate Mode, Linear. Now, if I play this, you can see, and I'm going to skip here, you can see when it goes from 600 back to 0, nothing actually changed here. And that's because I used this linear and made sure that it did 360 degrees of complete revolution. Now the next thing I'm going to do is see what the camera looks like. The camera is placed here. I think it'd look a little bit better if it was a little bit closer. So I'm going to go to View, Lock Camera to View. I'm going to zoom in using the middle mouse button. And now I'm going to see what it looks like when it's rendered. So this isn't bad, but I would prefer if we change the background. So I go to my world settings, I go to the background, drag that all the way to black. If I hit F12 just to see what it looks like when it's rendered, yes, this looks really good to me. Once again, the rust is a little bit overdone, and we could spend some more time on the rust, but you get the idea. And then if I hit spacebar, you kind of see what this looks like. So this is what we were going for. Now to set up the actual render, I can select for me, I used FFmpeg because usually that's what I want. Here you can select where it will be saved and what the name will be. And after you have selected FFmpeg, the encoder that you want is MPEG-4 and then H.264. So after that's all set up, and 1920 by 1080 is perfectly fine to do. Or at aspect ratio, you go to render animation, and then you will have the same animation I had. So I hope this was good for you. I hope that you now understand how to use the noise texture, and I hope to see you again.